So welcome to the CITRIS Research Seminar. It's my pleasure to introduce Joyojeet Pal, Assistant Professor at the University of Michigan at the School of Information there. So Joyojeet has been a colleague and friend and fellow traveler in the ICTD space for many years now, so it's great to see him come back as a member of the faculty at the iSchool at Michigan and continuing the kind of work he's been doing. So a lot of his research concerns, as many others here in Berkeley have worked on, technology and development, including working with children, children's sharing of computers and resource-strapped environments. The more recent work Joyojeet's been doing has been focusing on the very interesting question about technology accessibility in developing countries, in particular providing better accessibility to disabled populations, which is a very high policy item in a number of countries worldwide, and so this is a very timely research agenda that Joyojeet is embarking on. So it's very, again, great to introduce Joyojeet and to hear about his recent work. Thanks very much.
Great. Thanks a lot, Tapan. It's always great to be back in Berkeley. This was my first time in, I think, a couple of years. And I noticed that, well, this building didn't exist, so that was at least the one big change from in the past. So I'm going to be talking about technology and disability in the developing world very much within the context of ICT&D. And I'm going to assume that most of the people here, especially given this is a CITRIS talk, are familiar with the general ideas of technology and development and how work around accessibility and assistive technology fits in within the ICTD frame. Let me start off by talking about disability and assistive technology in the developing world and what are the existing concerns around this. There's obviously infrastructure concerns, comparatively high rates of extreme disability in the workforce age population. This is important the way that I defined it because as your lifespan gets higher, so does the rate of disability in a society, therefore, and definitions of what account as disability also differ from place to place. So, for instance, New Zealand has a very high rate of disability. That, in some sense, also means that one is more likely to live longer in New Zealand, for instance. Poverty is very high, up to 97%, unemployment across various kinds of disabilities. What's really most important here is the lack of state capacity to pay for assistive technology. Now think about this as accessibility as being a parent term under which there is adaptive technology, assistive technology, adaptation in a classroom setting, or adaptation of various other kinds, architectural accessibility, which could be things like your ramps and so on and so forth, as well as Braille signage, and assistive technology, which is going to be the bulk of what I'm going to talk about, which is to do with some interface with a computing device. There's a lack of institutions, much more so than compared to the developed world in terms of what kinds of associations exist, venues for education, and so on and so forth. Limited assistive technology research, again, partly because of states' ability to fund such research, and also because a lot of the assistive technology research has traditionally been in the developed world. I mean, at this point, you look at the assistive technology, the major institutions which are working on these tend to be either in the United States, parts of Western Europe, and of late, much more so in South Korea and Japan. I'll get to it briefly later. That's why that's so. Historical and representational issues. Now, I am a social scientist by training. I'm not a technologist. So part of the talk is much more looking at the social issues around technology and disability. But historically, in various cultures, disability has been seen in one of three various ways. One is punitive, which is that you're being punished for some reason, which is why you're disabled. The other is sympathetic, which is that somebody with disability is seen as through a sympathetic lens, or the third would be disability as a form of virtuous suffering. So by accepting this disability, I am suffering in a virtuous fashion, and this is true through various religious texts and historical stories and so on and so forth. Now, even though you might think that a lot of this is historical and so on and so forth, it's surprising how much of this is true in popular media, for instance. That's an entirely different talk on how disability is portrayed in popular media even today, including in soap operas and so on and so forth. Now, this leads to the idea of what is the public visibility of disability. By this, what I mean is that how do you expect to see in the public sphere somebody with a disability? And surprisingly enough, this too is something which is not studied a lot, which is that the idea that somebody who's blind might be seen as doing certain kinds of jobs, which is engineering people towards one or another kind of occupation. In Thailand, in many parts of Southeast Asia, for instance, working in massage therapy is something is seen as a very viable option for people with visual impairments. And what that leads to is that you imagine that somebody who is blind should be doing that kind of work. And likewise, the problem gets even more severe as the person's disability gets more severe, which is the point at which you think that this is a person who does not participate in the workforce actively. And even if they do participate, it is not generally in the sense of an equal to another mainstream population person. And that's the sense of viewing disability as charity. Now, what a lot of people are frequently surprised by finding out is that among the top disability-related organizations in the Western world, the one in Spain actually is also the top lottery owner of Spain. So it's ironic that this idea of, and when we talk about, I'll talk about some of our research in Latin America and how people who were trained with assistive technology frequently felt that people in the general society only viewed them as people selling lottery tickets. So that's the idea of disability and visibility. Now, why am I interested in these issues now? So what you have on the board is a map of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the various countries which have signed these, this convention. Now, what's important to look at over here is which are the countries which are in the orange, okay? So there are several levels of your signature and ratification. So the way international conventions work is, and I'll talk a little bit about what the convention is and why it's important, is that it comes out in the international arena and then countries can, the representative of the country goes and decides to sign on it. But that doesn't mean anything until your Congress or whatever your legislative body is ratifies that convention and then decides that whatever has been done, said in that convention, we will fulfill to our best abilities. Now, so if you notice that a lot of the, so there is yellow, which is signed the convention but not ratified it. There is light blue, which is signed the convention and the protocol. I'll talk about the protocol. There is the deep blue, which is ratified the convention, and there is the orange, which is ratified the convention and protocol. Now, in general, where you want to be is either the deep blue or the orange, which means that whatever your representative said, your legislative body has agreed that, yes, we will do this. The convention itself discusses a number of things that the country which signs agrees to do as a result of having signed it. The protocol says that for having signed this convention, my country also agrees to be vetted by an independent authority on whether or not we have fulfilled it in its true merit. Which means that if you are a citizen of a country and you feel that your country has signed the convention but not done what it has said it would do, you could actually sue the country, so to speak, in an international an international body put together by the convention, which will then listen to the argument. So agreeing to be at what is the orange level is a very high degree of commitment from the country in not only signing it, but saying that we are willing to have an independent body look at whether or not we are doing this right. Now, why is this important? So as you can see, many parts of the world have signed. And there are some parts of the world which haven't signed or ratified or anything. And some of these are kind of I don't want to say the usual suspects, but there are, like Switzerland, which doesn't do typically international conventions. There is, if you look over, there is Burma, Venezuela. So there's some countries which typically don't do international conventions at all. Interestingly, if you notice, even the US has just signed but not done anything beyond that. This is also part of US policy, which doesn't really go by international conventions as its local law. However, US has very strong existing laws relating to disability which precede the convention itself. Now, the convention opened in 2007. It's the highest first-day signatories in the history of conventions, more than any other convention, rights of the child, human rights conventions, everything. This is by far the highest. Why a convention? Is it repetitive, which means to say, is that from a legal point of view, if there is a convention on human rights, does it cover all humans? Therefore, is there a necessity for a separate convention of the rights of people with disability? And that's sort of a legal argument. In this case, it was seen as that is important because for certain populations which are seen as uniquely vulnerable, there is a need for a special definition of rights, and which is why we have conventions, we have similar international treaties for children and so on and so forth. So there were a number of moves by the United Nations from 1980s onwards around disability, and it sort of crescendoed in 2007 when this whole international convention came through. What does it define? Rights and recommend steps. Now, the difference between the two is that the rights refer to what might exist in your constitution which would be considered as discriminatory in some way. So classic examples of this is that several countries there were laws around who you could marry and not marry based on your disability. A lot of these don't exist anymore. But that would be so if two deaf populations cannot marry within themselves, and that would be an example of a kind of law which would be against the idea of the convention. Or if there are certain laws relating to abortion which are specific to mental retardation, that would be another case of discriminatory law. So it takes away issues around, so it addresses issues around rights, and it recommends steps for states. And this is the part that we'll spend much more time on, which is what does a state have to do to make its public sphere more accessible for its populations with disabilities. Now, within the idea of assistive technology within the United Nations Convention, there are several specific articles of the convention which are important, but I'm going to highlight 5 which I think are really important. So Article 4 promotes research and development of new technology at affordable cost. Then there is an article for early stage design and production of accessible ICTs. So it's the idea that even when you're thinking of a new technology, you already have the intention that you're not building this technology for a specific part of the population, but for everybody. They facilitate access to mobility aids and assistive technology, so every state undertakes this. And if you look at Article 21, that is the most important, one of the most important, which is reasonable accommodation at the workplace, which means that if you have a person with some kind of a disability in your workplace, it is your duty to make sure that the accommodations required for that person would be provided. Now, if I go back to the map of who has signed on the convention, you'll notice that a number of the countries which have signed are amongst the poorest in the world. As a result, the question becomes, what does this do for the operational viability of the convention in the long run? Now, I just ran down some figures to look at what is the cost of something like a screen reader, and I'll talk about a screen reader in detail later, for everybody in a blind population in 5 countries. And each of these 5 countries which you have here, Australia, Brazil, Mongolia, Niger, and United Kingdom, each of them has signed the convention at its highest level. So it signed it and agreed to and ratified it and so on and so forth. So for each of these populations, you can look at the cost to GDP for some of these countries, like Niger, for instance. If it were to try and provide a screen reader for everybody who needed it, it would in fact be larger than their defense budget, just to give you an idea. Now, there is, however, a reporting mandate, which means that every country which has signed and ratified doesn't sign and ratify it and go home. It means that after a period of 2 years, it has to report back to the United Nations what has it done to make assistive technology more viable for its populations. So there is 3 layers which I define here based on how much progress has been made. There's excellent progress on regulatory and legal issues. As we see on the slide over here, is that 91% of the countries included have constitutional regulation on rights. They define these specifically. There's a clear definition of rehabilitation services and definition of reasonable accommodation, which over 50% are also requiring it at work. Now, some progress in infrastructural and administrative level spending. I'm dividing these as one, what can you really change at the constitutional level? The second is what can you do at the governmental level? And the third is what do you do which needs some kind of additional spending for the population? And what I have on my slide here is that the third level, which is that what the country actually needs to do for the population, is the place where the least amount of progress has been made from the countries where there has been a survey so far. The survey is done by G3ICT, which is a body which is UN mandated on looking at disability in the developing world. So, a quick introduction to assistive technology and vision impairment. I'm guessing a lot of you are actually already familiar with it, but there are actually 3 ways, there are 3 types of populations that we are broadly interested in. People who have low vision, then there are people who are blind and legally blind, and the third is people who are deaf-blind. In the low vision category for assistive technologies, you primarily have technologies around some form of magnification or making existing text better available. And in the more in the blind and deaf-blind categories, you have more use of tactile as well as audio-based technologies. So an example would be something like a Braille display, which is a series of cells which will give Braille characters and so on and so forth. So you could also classify the technologies by function, and this is really useful if you're looking at actually building technologies in this space. There's the back end, which is optical character recognition, Braille translators, or screen readers, which we'll talk about a lot. There is the input, which is speech recognition. In some languages, speech recognition has really gone very far, and Braille keyboards. And then there is the output, which for the low vision population could be high resolution displays or magnification, and speech synthesizers, which is basically reading out to you the text which might be on the screen. Now, the concern areas, the way I've defined these very broadly, is on the back end, there is application support. So you have several existing screen readers, but you have more and more applications coming about, and the screen readers are kind of trying to keep pace with supporting these applications appropriately, especially as you have new screen readers which are not proprietary, open source. How are these managing to keep up with these new applications? We'll talk about that a little bit. Input, language support, and machine learning. So language support is important from both the input and output side. So the machine's ability to process new languages as well as output in those new languages. And finally, on the hardware side, the concerns are mainly for Braille displays. Okay? Now, so what could be the agenda? And when I define the agenda, I'm keeping it really fairly limited to the agenda for people who are interested in technology and development and have either a social science or a technology background with the intention of working in this space. So there's a general educational agenda. Surprisingly enough, and I said this in an earlier slide, there are only 9% of all the countries which were studied in the G3ICT, which is the people who signed in the countries which signed in the first year, had any kind of mandatory training on disability studies. Now, and this 9% was also presumably all upper income countries and not all developing countries. So this is a huge problem. You could go through an entire college education without any introduction to disability in most countries around the world. Okay? And the places where there are disability studies, it frequently comes in later in life. Now, the outcome of this often is that most people are surprised at even the thought that somebody who might be blind can actually use a computer, because the entire introduction to disability studies does not exist. So this is an area which needs a lot of interest. technology agenda, what we're already good at is interfaces for low vision populations. The work which is happening on magnification, etc., is actually already at a very advanced level. The general mechanisms of mobile keypads. So one of the big areas in ICTD has been the impact of mobile telephony. So most of if you have a touchpad mobile, does anybody have a touchpad mobile anymore? Everybody's gone to iPhones and so on. So anyways, so the touchpad mobile actually, if you notice, the number 5 frequently has a slightly raised indicator there, and that comes from accessibility related issues, which is that it helps you to understand where the center of the mobile is. So there is already some work on the general mechanics of mobile keypads, but touchpads is another very complicated area. Earlier on, things like iPhones were seen as very unfriendly to the needs of people with vision impairments. However, over the last 2 or 3 years, there's been more and more work on how touchpad-related cellular technology can be used for people with disabilities. There's also small corpus speech recognition, which is things like storing a person's name on your cell phone and calling them and all that. So these kinds of things we've already progressed a lot in. Now, from the perspective of the developing world, what are the areas that could be much more important going ahead? One of them is language input. Well, in general, what I'm saying is that the overall idea of creating better screen readers which support more applications is paramount. But in addition to that, you have the issue of language input, which I've talked about briefly, increased web accessibility. So on web accessibility, this basically refers to how well, for the vision impaired population, an existing website can be read out through a screen reader or any other technology that they're using. And most of the work around web accessibility is in that space. Now, there are existing corrective tools which will take a web page and then conduct corrections to it, but these don't work very well. And as you have more and more people building pages on Flash and so on and so forth, the problems in this are more severe. There is also an issue of social networking for people with vision impairments, and I will talk very briefly about one specific group which is working in social networking around visual impairments. In mobile devices, there is the issue of easy interfacing with Braille displays. So right now, if you're using a deaf-blind communicator, I'm not entirely sure about this, but I think that the minimum cost for a deaf-blind communicator is in the range of $3,000. So for a mobile device to talk to a Braille, for you to be able to get a mobile device which talks to some kind of tactile output is actually very expensive at this point. There's also OCR for OCR generally works well for most, a small subset of languages, but not all. And there's also problems around image capture. So if you look at a lot of the new literature which is coming out around technology and disability, it's in the area of wayfinding for people, as well as the identification of various items. For instance, somebody who's blind walking through a supermarket, can they use their cell phone to identify what items they're going through? So actual image processing on a cell phone is something which actually has a lot more work to do. Building screen readers for cell phones. Now, right now, there are a couple of screen readers for cell phones, but most of these work on higher-end phones. Mobile Speak is on Symbian, but there is still a lot more work to be done on this. And like I said, this layered with the speech synthesis problem also complicates the issue. Interfaces for text messaging. A lot of people don't realize that it's actually text messaging for somebody with a vision impairment is actually not trivial. There are a few approaches to this. You can do a multi-tap approach, but you can't, for instance, do your T9 predictive text type of stuff. And finally, wayfinding. So how far can you combine GPS or other technologies which allow people to navigate to work with mobile devices? So in continuing this agenda, I also think that there is a lot of areas where you can find the importance of technology and development in management studies. which is how the assistive technology and accessibility market is likely to increase over the next decade, especially given that all these countries have signed on to it and therefore are promising to work on this in some form. So there's also a change in the major tools. So for people who are familiar with screen readers, the really dominant screen reader, the windows of screen readers, is something called JAWS. The JAWS currently goes at a market price of about $1,000, and the competitors to JAWS are still far behind. I have a graph later on which I'll show looking at that. There is social science issues around the understanding technology training, and this is a good place where social scientists who look at how training works, as well as technologists who design these training courses, have the potential to collaborate together on how early introduction to technology happens for populations which don't have the same introduction to computing artifacts in their day-to-day lives, which is frequently true for most of the developing world. There is issues around workforce integration, and especially our jobs being offered at the levels appropriate to the training of a person. So I'll talk briefly about some work in Latin America in which we found that even if a person was trained to do very complex tasks on a computer, the idea that they are blind would mean for bosses that they would give them the most menial tasks. Aspiration and social visibility. I already talked about social visibility, but an important social science agenda is how the aspiration of an individual changes in terms of what they thought they could do in their life once they've been through the introduction to assistive technology. There is a policy agenda, which is very important, which is, and of course, there's one last thing in social sciences agenda, which is how we can study voluntarism and crowdsourcing as relevant to assistive technology. So is it possible to build languages with corpuses which are donated by people who are speakers of the languages, but those languages themselves might be too small to create a business interest to develop technologies there. Policy agenda, there is the implementation of the convention. If you noticed, I discussed the fact that the convention has several articles which very specifically mention assistive technology, their provision by the government, and so on and so forth. The more specific a convention is, the more the problem that it will not be followed in its true spirit. Therefore, is it good for a convention to be more specific, or is it good for a convention to be more open, and therefore you can't necessarily say that the convention was broken in its spirit? Then, the other huge question is, how do we reconcile intellectual property? So clearly, the one issue is things like there are things that JAWS can do right now. JAWS or Window Eyes, the two major software, which it would be great if the open source software could do, but it is guarded intellectual property. Now, from a normative perspective, can we think of this in the same way as we see, for instance, medical support in the developing world, where the approach was frequently that, okay, this is something that is needed, and therefore we cannot ethically be willing to provide this medicine at the price required by what was being charged for it in the developed world. So that's sort of a broader question. And the last thing is what happens when laws collide. A classic case of this is the right to read. Now, assuming in a country you had the right to read, but there wasn't a lot of material available if you were vision impaired in the appropriate formats. Is it then legal for you to pirate that material and put it on and provide it, given that you have the right to read? There's actually an organization in India which does this, which precisely takes material, pirates it, and says, oh, we have the right to read, but you haven't given this material to us in an accessible format, so we're just going to put it up there. So these are agendas which are within the social science area. Now, assistive technology within ICTD. And I have actually, in my own personal life, made a very conscious decision to start working in this space because not only because I believe in the importance of the work that has to be done over here, but also because I think that within ICTD, it is a very specific niche area which is unique, and I'll try and make the case for that over here. So Let's look at what has failed within ICTD space. First thing is that wherever the user's perception of the need for something has not been at the same level as the producer's perception of need. So for example, where you have these projects which provide agricultural prices for farmers and so on and so forth, and then you have that, and then it doesn't work out because you and I sitting in this room think that, oh, well, farmers should really want the prices for how much they could sell corn for at this other X market, but the farmer doesn't pick it up. This is in part because of a lack of perception of need and the lack of the usability of the information in the same way as the person designing things to the way the person who's actually going to be using it perceives it. Is there a community for adoption? Again, a lot of the ICTD things which have failed because the adoption by an individual is not sufficient if the adoption by the larger community that the individual affiliates with takes into account. Is there a low-tech option? I mean, this idea actually came from Kentaro's slides, who's sitting right up here in the front. I was looking at his talk on the 10 myths of ICTD, and one of them which struck me, which I read as, like, is there a way of doing something through low-tech which cannot be done in the high-tech way? In the case of assistive technology, I would say that frequently the answer to that is no. And is there a current structure of doing things which is being ruffled? Often when you see these technology courses, these technology innovations which are being put in the developing world, it changes the structure of the way that people are doing things in a fundamental way, such that there's actually a loser involved. In this case, again, I argue that that is not the case. Why is accessibility different? Well, historically, the uptake of assistive technology has been very significant post some kind of a legal initiative to make access more widespread. If you look at the assistive technology market in the US after the Americans with Disabilities Act and the IDEA Act, you see that there is a much more significant development of tools, number of companies getting involved, because there is a law which puts it in place. In the US and many countries in Western Europe and Japan as well, is that you can actually ask the state to provide, which is what the convention is trying to do, of when you need some kind of assistive technology. So this is a business case for why this, I think, is likely to happen. There are obviously exceptions to the rule where people haven't adopted the technology even when you assume that they should. Aged populations or people with late life disabilities are the cases which are documented from the research on assistive technology. There is also taboo in many parts of the developing world around disability. So for instance, now when we're doing some work in India, when we go to a disability organization, frequently we come across people who are adults who are learning basic motor skills because they have never been let outside of the home in their entire lives. As a result, technology is a huge leap that they are even at the point of just learning basic wayfinding, not even frequently have not even used a cane up to their adult life. Now, assistive technology as introduced in early childhood is generally seen as very successful. The literature really supports that if you introduce the child to it, they're likely to uptake it much more. Empirical research shows that assistive technologies feel unchallenged in the developing world. What this means is that there isn't so much that people don't want to use assistive technology. What we find in Latin America, which I'll come to in the next slide, is that people are learning the assistive technology, using it, but actually want to be given more challenging work to do with the assistive technology rather than being stuck in a situation where they're trying to keep up with what they've learned to do. Is also a very high existing adoption of mobile telephony in the population with disabilities. So I can make the claim that even if you don't think that screen readers or computing-based technologies are the way to go for providing quality assistive technology, that there is still enough of an agenda around mobile technology that people in ICTD should be paying serious attention to assistive technology. And finally, even if you discount all of these things and say that there is likely to be a very small population which is interested in assistive technology and likely to uptake that assistive technology, even that small population of slightly better off, slightly more educated populations in the developing world is high enough, and they don't have the tools that this is an important, urgent agenda for the ICTD people to look at. Now, some of the current work, I know I'm like 5 or 7 minutes remaining before I go for Q&A, but I'm going to go very quickly over what we're doing right now. We're doing work on qualitative assessments of people with disabilities who are transitioning into the workforce. This is being done in India, Guatemala, Mexico, Colombia, and we tried doing some work in Sierra Leone, which I'll get to as well. So in this, what we're doing is we are talking to people with disabilities who have just learned how to use screen readers and then are either transitioning into workforce or at late stages of going through training with screen readers to understand how their aspirations have changed, as well as how their transition into workforce itself is working out. Looking at policy studies around the United Nations Convention and how it reconciles with copyright law, the stuff which I talked about, and understanding the approaches of various countries, especially the poorer countries, in making their promise to the UNCRPD come true. Now, on the technology side, we are looking at some work. I have some students who've done work on developing quick interfaces for small languages and less representative languages. And I'll do a demo of the Hindi language screen reader that we have. And there's a small technology and disability in the developing world conference, which I encourage you to come and talk to me about if you're interested in getting to be part of that. Now, the early work with early results from social science work, or ROC, as I've spelled it over here, is we've done about 20 interviews with users in Bangalore and are collaborating with Microsoft Research in India on the workforce transition work. And we finished the first round of research in Latin America with 60 interviews. This is actually a full report is available for anybody who wants it. Send me an email and I'll send you the full report on disability in Latin America and transition to workforce. This was done with University of Washington and Organization of American States. Is sort of a UN equivalent. There are very important contrasts from the early work, especially when I look at how you compare what we are finding in India with what we found in Latin America. In Latin America, we found a very significant issue with visibility of disability. So a lot of people who are disabled telling us that people don't see them as working in an office. People see them as working in selling certain kinds of products or services which they see as blind people as being engineered towards. On the contrast, in India, a lot of people had very significant positive effects of aspiration that the technology has actually made them much more enthusiastic about what the future might hold for them. The third one, which is not much of a slide, is that we had a great deal of difficulty working in Sierra Leone, partly because the availability of services for people with disability there is much more severe, far fewer. In fact, the whole country had just one Braille embosser, which is a printer, and even that is currently on the blink. Possible explanations in a lot of Latin American countries are actually quotas for people with disabilities. So there's 2.5% quota in Venezuela, 2.5% in Ecuador, 3% in Venezuela, so which companies beyond a certain number of employees need to hire that number of people. So as a result, a lot of the hires tend to be perfunctory, where people, obviously I'm generalizing over here, where people with a disability might get hired to fill up the quota. In comparison to that, India didn't have the same situation. Obviously, then that creates a difference in the sample itself. And there's also general enthusiasm on computing in India. This is something that I've found in my past work, and much lesser expectation for work. So somebody who had a serious vision impairment early in life didn't really expect to be part of the workforce. So even being in some form part of the workforce created a much greater positive impact. I'm going to very quickly show you a demonstration of the Hindi screen reader work, but to very quickly show you what the market looks like, is that right now the big leader is NVDA, is JAWS, as you see. This is just what is installed in people's machines. Now, even though what you see as NVDA, that's non-visual desktop access, is an open source option, it actually, this is just what is installed, which means the person might have NVDA installed, but is primarily using JAWS. Now, the interesting thing with NVDA is that it works with an eSpeak TTS, which is a mechanical voice. And what we did was an installation for Devanagari. Now, I wanted to show you very quickly what makes Devanagari very interesting. And you'll see this in the, if this reads it out. So this is an implementation on Web Anywhere, which is a web-based screen reader.
Page load Pinagayake. A list sheet projects of a link. BBC Hindi. Perlapana. Link British Broadcasting Corporation Chair BBC Go. Satsuki Cheraito. Link BBC Hindi Bakale. Link Angrezi Kepane Bakale.
Anyway, so I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but in a nutshell, what I wanted to really explain here is that there's one interesting thing about the Hindi language which makes it a very interesting case for screen readers, which is that it's more or less perfectly phonetic. So if you have the word, say, Hindi. Whoa, what am I doing? Okay. Okay. What? Clearly my handwriting skills haven't. Okay, so the way you'd write this in Hindi would be there are two different ways of writing the N, but okay. Okay, just imagine there's a stick on the other side. Okay, so the point with this is that the language actually almost maps perfectly from letter to letter. So the H is exactly this, the I is exactly this, the N, this is actually the half N, so when you write it, you might not write this is the N symbol, but you just write the dot on top, and the D symbol is the D symbol, the way it's written over here, and the I symbol would have, oh, yes, and it works. So the point with this is that no two people who read it would actually read it any way different. So if it's written, you can't say the word column, for instance. Somebody who learns to speak English might say it's column, but you couldn't do that in Hindi. It's written the way that you read it, except that there is one problem, which is that of a schwa. A schwa, if people who have a kind of a background in linguistics might know, or people who speak Hebrew, I think, is if you write the symbol for the N, this is the N. So when you write it, you actually, you pronounce it, the machine will pronounce it as a N with the sound at the end of it. So it gets pronounced as Hinadi if you hadn't, and this is a problem when there are certain words which appear. The reason why I went through this completely complicated explanation for this is that I'm going to show you what happened when we actually tested this out. What we found was we did tests with various kinds of scenarios for people to understand words in various settings, and the N here is wrong, but only know that the most important finding was that in general, when you had native speakers and non-native speakers, the thing that they had most difficulty with was identifying those words which had a schwa deletion problem. Now, the reason why I mention this is that this is a problem which is very easily solved by through computing, and this has been a problem that people in speech have been working very actively in Hindi for a long time. I'm not doing a great job of explaining this slide, but I know I'm almost out of time, so I'm just going to let you believe that in short, when you have various languages written in the Devanagari script, it's actually very easy to make them work on mechanical, with mechanical text-to-speech. And there are a number of languages which already have existing mechanical text-to-speech. In other words, if you're teaching a class, an HCI class, it's a great project to give one of your students to pick up one of these various Devanagari script languages and do an implementation of that. And it's going to be something that is going to be clearly valuable to people in the developing world as well. I wanted to close my talk by actually showing this rather interesting image of Miss Landmine in Cambodia. Interestingly, if you haven't noticed, there was a Miss Landmine contest in Angola some years ago. I think it was 2008, and then there's a Miss Landmine in Cambodia. It's very interesting how there is this image of pride associated around a disability. And what's really, in my mind, the most important part of the United Nations Convention is the fact that it has changed the discussion of disability from a medical view of disability to a rights-based view of disability. That a person is not disabled purely from the medical definition, but is disabled precisely because there is not the social, there is not an infrastructure which is accessible, or a social public sphere that is accessible for people with disabilities. So, having said that, I'm going to open up for questions. I know I just have 5 minutes, but please take it away.
Does anyone have any questions for Professor Paul? Please use the mic. All right.
You talked a lot about some interesting different forms of disabilities, but are you also considering mental disabilities?
Yeah, so I personally am not working on that. However, there is an increasingly large community of people who are interested in issues around autism and technologies which are developed for people with various types of autistic situations. So, but I'm not working on it. So.
Well, I guess you can always take questions afterwards. So thank you again, Professor Paul.
All right, thank you.